The first speaker we'll have speak is Paul Kellogg. He is an associate professor in the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies at Athabasca University, and he's the author of Escape from the Staple Trap, a forthcoming book from University of Toronto Press.
Thanks for asking me to speak. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start with that. We're looking at different kinds of, as I was doing some research to think about this, in Canada there's different kinds of market solutions on the table, as Greg said, looking for price signals. There's the cap and trade, and thank you for that, showing that video. That was really excellent. That's an excellent, it saved me a lot of my talk, but I don't have to go through some of the limitations of cap and trade after that very, very helpful video. My thesis is that we're asking the wrong question. The whole cap and trade or carbon tax debate, it's a wrong polarization. It's basically all it assumes that we can use the market to fix the environment. And I'm going to say that that's not true because, and this might sound a little weird, I'm going to say that the market itself is not the problem. The market didn't get us here. Capitalism got us here. And capitalism cannot be reduced to the market. Capitalism is about the market, but it's also about corporate power, corporate profits, class rule, states, and war. And they all have to be seen together. And in fact, if you look at the history of where the problem came from, systematically, the people who rule the capitalist system are willing to violate their rules of the market when their rule is threatened and when they can make new profits. It's an odd thing. If left to the market, we would never have got to this place, but the capitalist system didn't leave it to the market. In order to assert corporate power, they gave us car culture, they gave us the suburbs, they gave us the big war machine of the Pentagon, etc. Okay, so that's the thesis that I want to get to in 15 minutes. And say we have to get out of the whole market discourse. I'll come to that at the end. Now, everyone is getting into using the market to fix the environment. Now, I teach in Alberta, University of Athabasca, okay? And you know Alberta. It's that NDP province out there. What an interesting change we've had. If you don't believe me, look in the mirror. If you don't believe me, do the math. Does anyone follow the Alberta politics? Jim Prentice, the arrogant Tory premier, said that the problems of Alberta were, if you want to know what the problems are, look in the mirror, pointing to ordinary Albertans. That got people angry. And then he mansplained to Rachel Notley, the leader of the NDP, during the debate when she was giving some budget issues. He says, you know, the math is difficult. And I think that almost lost the election right there. Just a lot of people said, oh, goodbye. But a lot of people are now doing the math in this new NDP province called Alberta. And here's one new advocate. He's a new convert to the notion of a carbon tax in Alberta. I'm going to start with. Here's the quote. "We think climate change is happening," said Steve Williams at an Eco-Fiscal Commission event Friday in Calgary. "We think a broad-based carbon price is the right answer." He says, now he wants this carbon price to be not just for producers of carbon, that would be the oil sands industries, but for consumers of carbon, that would be you and I. Quote, "If you look at carbon production in the modern economy, about 80% of it is at the point of consumption or the point of use. So targeting fees just in industry does not get to it." Okay. That's Steve Williams. Who is Steve Williams? Steve Williams is the Chief Executive Officer of Suncor Energies Incorporated. Suncor is the biggest single exploiter of the tar sands in Alberta. Now here's where the charts come in. Table number 1 shows the top oil and gas producers in Canada, September 2012. Canadian Natural Resources was the first. Second is Suncor Energy. Third is Husky Energy. Fourth is Shell Canada. The list goes on. One little thing that this chart tells us, by the way, when I put together this chart, it blew my mind. The problem of the tar sands in Alberta is a Canadian problem, and we can't offshore it. The companies that are doing the damage are by and large Canadian companies. It's incredible. First, table number 1, the biggest oil producer in Canada, Canadian Natural Resources. The second is Suncor. The third, Husky Energy, which is a Canada-China corporation, etc. You've got the other Canadian corporations, Cenovus Energy, Encana, Penn West Petroleum, etc. That's the production. BOE per day stands for barrel of oil equivalents per day. Turn the page to table 2. This is the top 20 bitumen extracting. We're not allowed to call it tar in Alberta. If you call it tar, then you're a radical. So we have to say bitumen so that we can be neutral. It's all ridiculous. But this is a chart based on the different colors are the black is for Canada, etc. You can see the rest of it. Suncor is the leading tar sands extractor, both in terms of current production planned and things on the table. So that's what we're dealing with. And this is the guy who was suddenly converted to the carbon tax, Steve Williams of Suncor. It's quite disingenuous on his part. 3 years ago, Suncor had a different strategy. 3 years ago, they decided that the Tory party was not going to be the party of the future in Alberta, and they decided to give financial backing to the Wild Rose Party, which is the sort of Alberta version of Tea Party or the Canadian Alliance or whatever, a completely anti-royalty, anti-tax, pro-carbon producing party in the world. That blew up in their face. Wild Rose proved to be a completely unstable right-wing operation that would never win an election. They abandoned it quickly, and they are trying to cover their tracks by going for this the carbon tax thing. They want to run to the front. They know that one of the reasons that the NDP got elected in Alberta is because of the deep concern about what's happening in the tar sands. I started working there full-time in 2010, and it was very interesting to go to Edmonton and realize that there were more meetings going on about the environment in Edmonton than there were in Toronto. It belies Alberta's reputation, but the reason for it is straightforward, because when you're in the province, you know that something is wrong. You know that it's a strange economy where thousands of people fly in on the planes from the Maritimes in Quebec, go to the tar sands, work for 2 weeks in really bad conditions, then fly back to their families in the Maritimes. You can make quote-unquote a lot of money, but your life is a wreck. You go up, if you see what the tar sands tailing ponds, they're actually the new Great Lakes that we're creating up north in northern Alberta, they're full of the most awful toxic stuff. It doesn't take much to know that there's something deeply wrong in the way in which this economy is unfolding. That's one of the reasons the NDP got elected, and it's one of the reasons that Steve Williams feels he has to run to the front of this. He can no longer say that we don't want a solution. Okay, we've got a problem. Suddenly he says there's climate change. There's a climate change problem, and he wants to run to the front. But the problem, first of all, putting producers and consumers at the same edge is ridiculous. Very few of us have a big tailing pond the size of Lake Ontario outside of our house where we dump the excess waste from the production of tar. I mean, when you see what Suncor and the rest of the companies are doing up there to produce producers and consumers at the same, I mean, consumers should, we should all do our part, but the big issue is where the thing is from. Now, what about carbon? No, that's not what's on the agenda in Ontario. What's on the agenda in Ontario is cap and trade. Greg has covered that. The video has covered it very well. The interesting thing about cap and trade is that the only thing I'll add to that discussion is some words that came from Jeff Rubin, who's an economist at Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. Now, he ridiculed the cap and trade thing quite rightly up to a point. He said that market that they're describing, the market of trading the right to pollute, the pollution permits, etc., it starts out in Europe at a very high price for the thing, but over time, what are his facts here? He puts it down. It's become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to buy the right to pollute in California and Europe over time. And he says that this in itself is a condemnation of the cap and trade system. He's a little bit wrong, I think. He's pointing the finger in the wrong place. You could make that cap and trade system really expensive. You could make it really expensive if there was a hard cap imposed by governments, and that cap was enforced over time. The issue that he's pointing to is there are all the problems of cap and trade, as outlined there, are true in the video. There's another one, is that it depends upon the will of governments to say we are going to put a cap on and it's going to go down 10% and then it's going down 10% and it's going down 10%. And does the European Union have that will? Does California have that will? They have shown no evidence of it whatsoever. They're willing to let the market work, and it's not working. It's not working at all. What about the carbon tax? I think the carbon tax, Jeff Rubin says, why do a cap and trade? Go right to the carbon tax. Okay. If the debate is within the framework of the market, I think he's right. Go to a carbon tax. It's better than cap and trade. But it's not that much better. And it's got all sorts of problems. BC's had a carbon tax for 7 years. Here's a quote of one study: a tax of $30 per ton of carbon emitted adds about 7 cents to a liter of gasoline. BC's emissions have declined about 9.9% since 2008. That might have something to do with the Great Recession, but we'll go with that. While the economy has grown slightly more than the Canadian average. What's more, the carbon tax is supported by 64% of BC residents who receive lower personal and corporate income taxes. It's much simpler. It's much easier. You get some money in. It's a little bit better. But a 9.9% per capita reduction since 2008, is that going to deal, even without the other problems of the carbon tax, some of which Greg alluded to are there, will that deal with the problem of climate change over time? It won't deal with it at all. It's beginning to nip at the edges of the problem. It doesn't get down to the real thing. Now, capitalism is about more than just markets. Before we look to the solution, let's look to how we got here. One of the big issues about the production of carbon that we all know is that we've created societies in Canada, United States, Europe, Japan, and now elsewhere that are completely dependent upon the automobile. That did not happen because of the market. It happened because of capitalism and capitalist profits. In North America, at the early part of the 20th century, if a market is about, you go and you buy the cheapest way of doing something, a service or a good, the cheapest way to get to work in the early part of the 20th century in the major cities was by the street railway. That was the cheapest way to get to work. The street railway companies were ubiquitous. They weren't perfect. There was lots of problems with them, but the street railway was the beginnings of a certain sense that we would now see as public transit, although many of them weren't public. General Motors, Firestone, and a number of other corporations heavily invested in the oil and gas and motor car industry, created corporations which systematically purchased, some say 50 of the street railway companies, some people say as many as 100 of the street railway companies, and systematically dismantled them. Shifting, it happened in two steps. First, you shift from street railways on rail lines to buses, which use the internal combustion engine. Once you're committed to the bus, you're committed to building roads to sustain those buses. Once you start building a network of roads, it creates the infrastructure that allows for cars to become the way of transportation for ordinary people. Once you have cars and roads as the way in which we are organizing, the way in which we get around, you can create beautiful things like the suburbs and the exurbs, and create massive, massive distances between where we live and where we work, and we can drive back and forth on them the whole way. That was not done by the market. That was done by monopoly capitalism. That was done by corporate power and corporate greed that violated the rules of the market so they could protect their own interests, protect their class interests. We can't just see capitalism as the market. We have to see it as class power, as the power of the 1% who will do anything, including violating. We have to follow the rules of the market. They say to us, carbon tax, cap and trade, those are the two solutions. But when their interests are threatened, they're quite willing to get rid of the market right away. It's more than just about corporate power and monopolies, etc. It's also about public policy in states, because that interface between oil and between the auto corporations, the tire corporations, the oil corporations, and the dismantling of the infrastructure that was existing in the cities to get people to and from work and creating a new infrastructure prejudiced towards private car ownership was completely sustained by state policy. We have an image of the United States, for instance, as a place which doesn't like to use the state to intervene in the economy. That's not true. The United States is the biggest communist country in the world. If you define communism as state intervention, what's the biggest state corporation in the world? It's the Pentagon. The Pentagon is this massive operation. Okay, here's another example of state intervention to the economy. The massive use of taxpayers' money in the 1950s and 1960s to create the interstate network connecting cars from one city to another that has been replicated in every other country around the world. The template was built in the United States and everyone copies it. What if that is a public policy choice? It could have easily been a public policy choice to do other kinds of infrastructure and transportation. They chose that one. They chose that one for particular reasons. One of the reasons that choice has been made is because of the incredible corporate power and profits that exist organized around oil extraction and oil production. You can turn the page to Table 3. It's the best table. Table 3 shows you our problem. This is our problem. These are the 12 largest corporations in the world. 6 of them are oil corporations. Largest corporation in the world is ExxonMobil. 4th is Royal Dutch Shell, 11th is BP, and 12th is Chevron. I focus on those 4 because they're the remnants of what used to be called the 7 Sisters, the 7 oil corporations, the oil cartel that controlled the oil world from less. There's 2 other ones on the list, PetroChina from China and Petrobras from Brazil. 6 of the world's 12 largest corporations are the oil corporations. They are massively profitable, they have huge market share, and they have big vested interests in keeping this structure that we're involved in going. Cap and giveaway was exposed really well in the video. I won't go into it. Kathleen Wynn's going down that rabbit hole. We'll see what happens. Carbon tax is a little bit better, but it only nibbles at the edges of the carbon problem. This is the problem that we have to confront. We have to confront a world of corporate power and state power that is completely invested in the exploitation of carbon because that's where their profits come from. Let's actually take some lessons from capitalism to see what we need about this, to do about this. As I said, capitalism is more than just about markets, it's about corporations, about states. This can give us a clue as what to do. Now, I'm not a fan of nuclear power. Okay? Nuclear power is often put up as the desperate last-ditch hope for a carbon-free world. We'll get to nuclear power. The problems associated, and we're going there, you know. The figures are roughly this. The most number of nuclear power plants in the world is the United States. I think there's 60. China right now has 25 or 30 functioning nuclear power plants. It has on the board, China has on the board plans for the construction of another 250 nuclear power plants over the next 20 years. Huge. We are going to be confronted with another environmental problem soon on a massive scale. How did we get to nuclear power? It had nothing to do with the market. Zero. We got to nuclear power through something called the Manhattan Project. In the United States during World War II, they said we need to build a bomb, a nuclear bomb, to end the war. Who did they hire? They hired everybody. Anyone with a physics degree or anyone who could add and subtract was hired by the Manhattan Project. What was their budget? Their budget was unlimited. Spend whatever you want. And from that, they got the bomb that blew up in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then they figured out, oh, we can also use this to boil water to generate turbines to make electricity. And off we go with nuclear power. Nothing to do with the market. Everything to do with state power and state regulation and state organization, the focus of a ruling class. In this case, it was focused on destruction. It turned out to be able to boil water as well. We need the same thing, but not from states, from social movements. A Manhattan Project for conversion. We don't need a Manhattan Project for alternatives, because we know what the alternatives are. We've known them for a long time. We know how to do cogeneration, biomass, intensification, public transit, solar power, wind power. It's all there. It's all the technology is in place. What we need is the public commitment to conversion, to using that in a new green economy. A Manhattan Project with the same template as the Manhattan Project. Who do we hire? Everybody. What's its budget? Whatever it needs. Unlimited. And we'll start the process of doing it. But we're not going to get there through states. It's why we have to do meetings like this and organize events like the July 5th demonstration for green jobs that's happening. Because this will only happen through social movements, social movements that are focused on this kind of a public policy change at the top of the thing. We can take, we have, and I'll end with this, we have one good example from the recent past of putting together the building blocks of this. We had a catastrophe in 2009 when the Copenhagen summit collapsed in chaos. It was ridiculous. You know, gather the world's leaders together to come up with a solution for climate change, and what did they come up with? Nothing. And it just sort of ends in, and there was a lot of despair. I remember being around in Toronto at the time, people saying, whoa, that's it, it's over with. The ball was picked up, but it wasn't picked up from the global north, it was picked up from the global south. 2010, there was the extraordinary World People's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth, organized in a little tiny country, one of the poorest countries in the Americas, in Bolivia, in Cochabamba, gathered together 30,000 people from the social movements, from NGOs, 35,000 people, and they came up with a declaration which actually outlines the problem and outlines what we need to do. And I'll end with their words. It expressed its determination, quote, to deal with the root causes of climate change, including the elimination of unsustainable patterns of consumption and production in the developed countries, and the dominant global capitalist system that gives rise to these. Those 35,000 people gathered in Cochabamba pointed their finger exactly at the problem. We're going to have to deal with, to get climate justice, we're going to have to confront the climate destruction that has been caused by capitalism, and to get at it, we're going to have to deal with the corporations and states that have profited and benefited from this in a very big way. So my conclusion is a Manhattan Project for conversion of the economy driven by social movements from below. I have no idea what the shorthand for that is, but that's the general idea. Okay.